But I want to talk about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, one of the most important people of the 20th century, having a bit of a renaissance at the moment because there's a certain Canadian that some of you may have heard of called Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson has been advocating Solzhenitsyn as one of the great thinkers and great heroes and great minds of the 20th century. So many of a new generation have been introduced to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But I would like to, hopefully 45 minutes from now, you'll know much more about Alexander Solzhenitsyn than you do presently, because he is without doubt a giant of the 20th century and a hero of the 20th century. And I hope to show the difference between the two, because heroes are not always giants and giants are not always heroes. Very few are both. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is both. We'll say something more about giants and heroism as we go on. But I want to begin, I want to take two approaches to this, a brief approach for the first 10 minutes or so, which is a subjective approach. In other words, how Solzhenitsyn changed my life, so a personal testimony, and then the objective approach. So subjective, objective, as you probably should know, there are two ways of perceiving reality. There's the subjective, which is what I think something is, and there's the objective, which is what it is, whether I think it or not. And of course, the idea of life is to subject our subjective opinions to objective reality. In other words, don't expect reality to conform to you, you need to conform to it. But I'm going to talk first about the subjective approach to Solzhenitsyn and what he actually meant to me, because there's a great debt of gratitude in my writing of the book on Solzhenitsyn, as there was in the writing of my first book on Chesterton. So as a teenager, and I know some of you might know something about my own story, the 10-second version, I was a white supremacist neo-Nazi, went to prison twice for inciting racial hatred, and had a conversion to Catholicism. I was received into the church at the age of 29, largely through the influence of G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, C.S. Lewis, and a certain Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I was very anti-Catholic, which means that you would never have got me to read any book that purported to be Catholic, or indeed, for that matter, any book that purported to be Christian. I was anti-Christian, but particularly anti-Catholic. But I was interested in politics, obviously. And it was the politics of Chesterton that interested me at first. Chesterton's political vision was a real alternative to the communism which I despised, and the sort of the globalist corporatism, for want of a better word, of mammon, which was the dominant economic power in the West. I didn't like any of those models. I was looking for an alternative. Chesterton provided that with what he called distributism. Now, at the same time, before I first discovered Chesterton, I read as a teenager a thick book, that thick. I was probably about 15 or 16. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1. So it's that thick and it's Volume 1. It's already getting scary, right? In those days, people did read books, but for a 15-year-old, a book of that length was nonetheless formidable and daunting. And I had a very long commute and got through that, and I was so edified by Solzhenitsyn's courage in the face of this juggernaut of terror under which he'd lived, the Soviet communist system, that I went out and got Volume 2. And I'm actually old enough to have been there when Volume 1 first came out in the 1970s. And so ever since that time, Solzhenitsyn was a hero in my mind. In the 70s, in fact, he was a celebrity in such a way that you didn't have to put a caption on his photographs. Those of you that are old enough, as old as I am, his face was such that you just saw it in a newspaper or on television. You knew who it was. Like Barack Obama or Donald Trump. You don't need a caption because the face was so well known. He was one of the best known people in the world. And he remained a hero of mine, but then he went on the back burner, so to speak, as I was going through my conversion, didn't think too much about Solzhenitsyn, became a Catholic. And then in the late 1980s or early 1990s, Solzhenitsyn brought out a book translated into English as Rebuilding Russia. And I see this on a shelf. I open it. The political ideas and the political philosophy in this book echoes exactly the distributism of Chesterton and Belloc. So I admired Solzhenitsyn because he was a hero, because he had the courage as one man to stand up to the tyranny of the Soviet Union. But now I realize that he also actually had the same political philosophy which was instrumental in my conversion. There's a whole new level of affinity that existed between me and Solzhenitsyn. This rekindled my interest. So my book on Chesterton was published in 1996. And I decided to write to Solzhenitsyn to ask if I could write his biography. Now, even now, 20 years plus on, this seems preposterous. You had this man, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, one of the giants of the 20th century, and who am I? At this point, I had one book published, my biography of Chesterton, nothing else. And I don't even know how I got hold of Solzhenitsyn's address. He'd been living in exile in Vermont in the United States, but had returned to Russia in 1994 and now lived outside Moscow in the countryside. Somehow or other, and seriously, I don't remember how I got it, I found his address and I wrote to him. Good old-fashioned letter. And not expected to receive a reply. You know, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And in my letter, I basically said that I have admired him for a long while. I'm the author of a biography of Chesterton, and I've read all of the existing biographies of Solzhenitsyn, of him, and don't think any of them pay due attention to the centrality of his Christian faith. And I think this is the most important part of who he is and what motivates him, or you, obviously you, I'm writing to him. So I would like to write your biography. Of course, you know, ridiculous, who am I? So I wasn't expecting a reply, but I thought, you know, the best case scenario here is I get a reply, thanks but no thanks, yours sincerely, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I've got the great man's autograph. Hey, that's easy, right? That was worth a few minutes writing a letter. But imagine my astonishment when he wrote back and said, yes, indeed, he would be happy to cooperate with my writing of his biography and that I should arrange to come to Moscow to interview him and giving me the contact details of two of his sons who were educated in the United States and spoke fluent English as go-betweens, as contacts. I was absolutely astonished. I said in my biography that I'd written a biography of Chesterton, to make it not completely preposterous, but I couldn't believe he replied. So, armed with this letter, use your imaginations, this is a letter from Solzhenitsyn, right? That's it. It's easy to see that. So, armed with a letter of Solzhenitsyn, I go to see my publisher in London, it's HarperCollins, and I wave this letter of Solzhenitsyn in front of them. I said, you have to give me a contract to write a biography of Solzhenitsyn, and you have to give me an extra £5,000 so I can afford to go to Moscow and interview him. And they looked at the letter and looked again and said, I don't think that's going to be a problem. So, of course, I go to Moscow. I'm taken to Solzhenitsyn's house in the countryside by his son, Yermolai. And I still can't work out why on earth he would say yes. And then before he comes down to the room we're going to have the interview in, his wife made a point of taking me into another room, pointing up to a top shelf of one of the bookshelves there, the Ignatius Critical Editions Collected Works of G.K. Chesterton in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's personal library. So the magic word was G.K. Chesterton. Now, my biography of Chesterton, I've always said, was an act of thanksgiving. An act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God, an act of thanksgiving for God for giving me Chesterton. But now I have an act of thanksgiving for Chesterton for giving me Solzhenitsyn. And of course, the other factor was that he did agree with me that the previous biographies had not paid due heed to his Orthodox faith, to his Christianity. So then I made the mistake, which I thought might have been fatal, literally. I had all my questions lined out for him. I had the tape recorder set up. And actually, it was a three-way conversation, a round table. Solzhenitsyn answered in Russian. I asked in English. Yermolai simultaneously translated both ways. Solzhenitsyn's English is very good. And if I didn't know that from other reasons, just by looking in his eyes as I was speaking to him, as I was asking the question, he clearly understood what I was saying. But he answered in Russian for a very good reason, because he didn't want pidgin English. He wanted to make sure that his son spoke better English. But occasionally his son would reply in English to me, and Solzhenitsyn would say, that's not what I said, in Russian. Right? So, he's obviously listening to the way that his son is translating his words. So this went on. But at the beginning of the interview, the first two questions I asked were on politics. And when I asked the second question on politics, he said, I thought your biography was not going to be a political biography, but a biography that emphasized my Christianity. And I thought, oh dear, I think he's going to throw me out. I've come away from Moscow and he's going to throw me out. So I said, no, seriously, this is just preamble. It's not, and anyway, things got better after that. But a few things about him. I listed a list of Western authors of the Catholic literary revival to see if he knew about them. And I went through a list. Now, I can't remember all the names now, but the obvious people: Newman, Chesterton, Belloc, T.S. Eliot, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Evelyn Waugh. And his eyes were ashine, and he chuckled and said, I know them, and I admire them, and I would say that we are kindred spirits. And the other thing about him, which goes against the public figure of him, is we perceive Solzhenitsyn partly because of the way he presents himself, to be fair, but also partly because of the way the media has presented him, as a sort of stern Jeremiah-type prophet who doesn't have a sense of humor, right? He's always sort of telling us what's wrong and what we need to do. When you actually meet him, he has a great sense of humor. There's an infectious chuckle that's under the surface all the time. His sons told me that he has a great power of mimicry. He could mimic famous politicians. Would actually have them rolling about on the floor in hysterics as he's mimicking famous politicians. This is the unknown Solzhenitsyn. I did try to bring some of that out in my biography, although, he didn't do any mimics that made me roll on the floor. But I take their word for it. But I certainly did see, the sense of humor, the glint in the eye. But the other thing about him, how many people here have read anything by Solzhenitsyn? So a few. How many people here have read anything by, how many people here have read The Lord of the Rings? Quite a few more, okay. Well, this is one of the most profound moments in my life, was looking directly into Alexander Solzhenitsyn's eyes. And this was 1998, I think. He was 79 years old when I met him. A few months short of his 80th birthday. You look in his eyes, he has china blue eyes, very, very attractive blue eyes. You look into those eyes, and on the surface, they're youthful. I say mischievous, full of humor. They belie the years. It's as if you're looking at the eyes of a 30-year-old, not an 80-year-old. But if you hold the gaze, you could see the well of wisdom and suffering and experience. And it reminded me, as a lover of the Lord of the Rings, of the way that Treebeard's eyes are described as being. Now, they have this sort of youthful vigor on the surface, but there's this deep well of memory that's beneath the surface. Now, of course, I don't know, talk about subjective and objective. I don't know if that was really objectively there in the eyes, or whether I was subjectively projecting that. In other words, that all that I know and love and admire about Solzhenitsyn was present subjectively in our eyes meeting. But that's certainly what I experienced. It was one of the most important moments in my life. And of course, when people ask me, what moments in your life have given you the most, what do you feel most honored by? The fact that was granted that time with Solzhenitsyn, granted his cooperation with the biography. And by the way, he liked the biography sufficiently that when a revised edition was planned, he cooperated with the revised edition, and so did his sons. There's a new issue of my magazine that's come out last week on Solzhenitsyn, a centenary celebration, because it's 100 years. December the 11th will be 100 years since Solzhenitsyn was born. And in that, again, the Solzhenitsyn family cooperated fully in that. So they're very happy with my biography. And I remember, before I had any books published, after my conversion, after my bad years in politics, just saying a prayer that if just the Chesterton book could be published, I would consider my life was worthwhile, and I'd done at least one thing that was worthy, that maybe would undo some of the damage I'd done in my life when I was younger. And I said in that prayer that, Lord, I would consider my life complete if this book is published. And not only was that book published, of course, but many other books have been published since then, and that book was the key to my getting to meet Solzhenitsyn and writing the biography of Solzhenitsyn, which I do believe, and I believe Solzhenitsyn believed, is the book that does put his Christian faith at the center of his life and the motivation for his life. Okay, so that's the subjective side. Now, there might be some people here, and I'm sure there are some people here, that are wondering when I'm going to have a sip of wine. Cheers. Well, this is all great, but who on earth is Solzhenitsyn? Well, you've got some idea of his importance now, I hope, but the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk about objectively about Solzhenitsyn's importance to our world, to the 20th century and to the 21st century, who he was and the lessons he teaches. And I'm going to begin with 3 questions that I'm not going to answer. 3 rhetorical questions, which you can actually frame as questions, if you like, in the Q&A, and then I will endeavor to answer. First is, do great men make history? Or, second question, does history make great men? Or, does history sometimes smother great men, as Thomas Gray seems to imply in his elegy in a country churchyard? Who's read Gray's elegy in a country churchyard? So I can't resist. Anybody here read? One hand goes up. 2 hands went up, I think. Any advance on 2? 3. One of the greatest poems in English language, Thomas Gray's elegy, written in a country churchyard. Your homework, go home and read it. It's not very long. Take you about 5 minutes. But basically, the poet is in the 18th century, is in a country churchyard in England, and he's musing, looking at the gravestones. The sun's setting, the cows are lowing, and he's looking at the gravestones, and he's pondering, which person here, which Cromwell, guiltless of his country's blood. In other words, what great man who could have emerged and been a tyrant because of his circumstances, being a peasant in a village, for all of his gifts, never rose to become that tyrant. So does history sometimes smother great men, as Thomas Gray seems to imply? And the other question that is at the center of any discussion of Solzhenitsyn is Lord Acton's famous axiom that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. In other words, that the centralization of power into too few hands leads invariably to tyranny. The life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn throws light on these questions and helps us understand not only history and the nature of power, but our own times and the nature of man himself, who we are. Indeed, I would suggest that understanding Solzhenitsyn will help us understand ourselves. So who was Solzhenitsyn? Now, as I've said, he was born a century ago. On December 11th, it will be a century. History buffs will know he was born in Russia on the 11th of December, 1918. It was just over a year after the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917. So he was born into a secular fundamentalist tyranny. Indeed, as if to set the scene for his life and the sufferings in his life, even the 9 months in the womb were not unproblematic for Solzhenitsyn. Apart from the fact that the communists had just taken over the country, while he's in there, 3 months in utero, his father is killed. So he never knows his father. And then on the 5th of September, 1918, so when he's end of the first trimester, his father dies. End of the second trimester, the 5th of September, 1918, the decree of the Red Terror is passed, which calls for mass executions and authorized the new Soviet Republic to defend itself, quote, against its class enemies by isolating them in concentration camps, end quote. So the word concentration camp predates the Nazis. In fact, to be honest, the British did it during the Boer War, and I think they called them concentration camps. So mea culpa, maxima culpa, to take the blame of the British upon myself here, the scapegoat. So even before Solzhenitsyn is born, but when he's alive, developing human person in the womb, his father dies, and the decree of the Red Terror is passed, which leads to mass executions, the world in which he's going to live. This was the world into which Solzhenitsyn was born. You know, and we're tempted to think, we look at the mess in our country. I'm a US citizen, by the way, so I can't say our country. Right? I get the worst of both worlds. I'm a US citizen, and I've got to blame myself for the British. I mean, so we think things are bad these days. But think of the world that Solzhenitsyn was born in, where Christianity was outlawed, where people were being sent to prison and indeed summarily executed by the tens of thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, merely for being Christians. Solzhenitsyn, of course, his earliest memories are of a sort of Christianity. He had aunts and his mother who still had the Russian Orthodox faith. They were brought up, of course, before the revolution. Some of his earliest memories are of crucifixes and icons in his mother's home. But at the age of 11, as I think was compulsory, he joined the Young Pioneers, which was the communist equivalent of the Hitler Youth, the youth movement. He joined the Young Pioneers and, like every good, dutiful communist, became a dutiful atheist. he dreamed of writing an epic novel like War and Peace. But instead of it having the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars, to have the backdrop of the glorious Bolshevik Revolution. The first great communist epic. That's what he dreamed of writing. But he thanks God that suffering brought him to his senses. And he talks about 3 pivotal moments in his life that were crucial. Again, whenever we use the word crucial, we need to remember where it comes from. Crucial from crux, from the Latin for cross. Because those crucial moments were moments of the cross, moments of suffering. The first is his experience fighting in the Red Army, in the Soviet Army, on the Eastern Front against the Germans in World War II. He's an officer in the Russian Army, in the Soviet Army. He wrote a long poem that I recommend, but it's horrific, called Prussian Nights. Some of his experiences of the war. In actual fact, because we have younger people here, I'm not even going to be explicit about some of the horrible things that happened that should sicken any of us. But basically, you can use your imaginations, those of you who have them. If you don't, get one. Joseph Stalin basically told the Soviet army that the advance on the Eastern Front into German territory was about vengeance. And they should do what they liked. No holds barred. That women and children should not be respected. And they weren't. One thing I can say is there were a lot of Russians fighting in the German army. And Solzhenitsyn, of course, as an atheist and a communist and as a patriot, couldn't understand why any Russian would want to fight in the German army. He would meet many of these in prison when he was sent there himself, those that weren't summarily executed. And he says that they fought furiously. He tells stories about, outnumbered, they just would not surrender. And about one who was just forced down into a cellar in a house, and they wanted him to surrender. He didn't want to surrender. They threw in a hand grenade. And I thought, that, obviously a hand grenade into a cellar, he's dead. And they go down to the cellar, and he's basically dug another foxhole within the cellar, and he starts shooting them when they come down. Of course, they kill him. Another time, he sees a Russian soldier, 3 Russian soldiers, but with German uniforms on, being marched as prisoners of war. And one of them dodged away from the guards and threw himself under a tank. And the tank veered away at the last moment to try to avoid him, which means he didn't die straight away. But he died. And Solzhenitsyn said these people knew that the fate that awaited them for fighting against this communist system, the Soviet system, was worse than death. Better die like a soldier under the tracks of a tank than be hanged like a dog in a Soviet prison cell. And to his own shame, Solzhenitsyn talks about a time when he's an officer and he sees someone shouts to him in Russian, and this person is naked from the waist up, but he's got German uniform, trousers on, but he's obviously Russian. And he shouts to Solzhenitsyn as an officer to intervene. He's being whipped mercilessly by one of the security, in other words, secret police within the army. Solzhenitsyn basically walked on as if he didn't hear, because he knew that if he intervened, he would be also seen as a traitor. And that cowardice played on his conscience. And what I've just recounted, by the way, is not the most horrific parts of the story. Some of it is worse. But this experience of the barbarism of his own army obeying the orders of the Supreme Commander, Joseph Stalin, to wreak vengeance, opened Solzhenitsyn's eyes. And then he made a mistake. He wrote a private letter to a friend in which he criticized Stalin. Now, there were no private letters in the Soviet Union. Letters were opened, they were read. He was charged with treason against the motherland for privately criticizing Stalin and was sentenced to 7 years hard labor. And in my book, I have a weakness for puns. So in my book, the title of this chapter about after his arrest is Arrested Development. But the point is that's exactly what it was. And Solzhenitsyn saw the arrest as the first of these crucial, pivotal moments in his life. Because by being arrested, by the communist system that he loved and subscribed to, his whole world collapsed. His whole world collapsed, but his eyes were opened. And for Solzhenitsyn, any amount of suffering is worthwhile if it brings us to the truth. And then, after 7 years, from 1945 to 1952, in the forced labor system, which actually, again, I can't remember the exact titles of this, so I'll not look it up. But there's a chapter, I think, called Hell into Purgatory. Solzhenitsyn himself is haunted by the figure of Dante. His novel, In the First Circle, is related to Dante's first circle of hell in the Divine Comedy. But Hell into Purgatory, that the prison, the arrest and the first experience of prison was a hell. But that hell turned into purgatory. So another chapter in my book is Profit from Loss. That's profit spelt both ways. Puns, right? And again, I'm reminded, can't help but being reminded of how the prison sentence on Oscar Wilde had exactly the same impact. Hell into purgatory, so that when Oscar Wilde gets out of prison, he can write in the Ballad of Reading Gaol, but God's eternal laws are kind and break the heart of stone. For how else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in? Like Oscar Wilde, Solzhenitsyn believed that his heart had to be broken. His Marxist heart had to be broken so it could bleed and understand reality. So, for instance, because he was a mathematician, he was spared at first the labor camps because of his brain. He was actually put into a research prison where scientists were working on ways of basically tapping people's phones. So this is a communist system for you, sending people to prison for political offenses and then using them as forced labor to develop new means of becoming even more efficient totalitarians. Solzhenitsyn called this the first circle of hell, and his novel In the First Circle is based upon this. That they were being offered comfort in return for corruption. And for Solzhenitsyn, it was too high a price to pay. And he chose the labor camps. And you have to understand what that means, by the way, because very few people survived the labor camps. The labor camps were death camps. You know how harsh the Russian winter is. Read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, with the cold temperatures. And they're out there working with insufficient clothing, insufficient food. The way that Solzhenitsyn talks about how eating the thin gruel that they were served twice a day was a sacramental experience. You savored every sip. So he was expecting to die, but he would rather die with dignity in a Soviet labor camp than be corrupted in comfort in the first circle of hell. And then the third and final most important defining moment in his life, the crucial moment, was just as he gets sent out of prison. You might think, we've all had hardships in our life, all right? Unavoidable. The one thing that we all should know, and if we don't know, we need to know, is that we will have crosses to carry. And not just talking about Christians, we're talking about anybody. Everybody will have crosses to carry. In other words, suffering is completely, utterly, inexorably unavoidable. The only thing we can choose is what we do with the suffering. Do we respond to the suffering, to our being crucified by the suffering of life, like the good thief or the bad thief? Do we curse God, who's next to us, on the cross next to us, being crucified by us? And do we curse our neighbor for our suffering, blame everybody except ourselves? Or do we accept, like the good thief, that we deserve the suffering that we have, embrace it, not just accept it? There's a wonderful novel by Maurice Baring in which a character in the novel, who's a priest, says, the acceptance of suffering is the secret of life. When you understand that, you will understand everything. Not suffering, but that's going to happen to all of us. But the acceptance of suffering. And if we actually get deeper in our spiritual life, we get to not just the acceptance of suffering, but the embrace of suffering. Taking up our cross with the help of Christ and finding a joy therein. The motto of the Missionaries of the Poor, joyful suffering with Christ on the cross. Not joyful suffering of Christ on the cross, or we at the foot of the cross. No, joyful suffering with Christ on the cross. The embrace of suffering. This is the lesson that Solzhenitsyn teaches us. And he certainly doesn't have an easy life, right? He's grown up in communism. He's brainwashed into atheism. Fights in a communist army of barbarians and witnesses hellish things during World War II. And then he's imprisoned for 7 years for the heinous crime of writing a private letter to a friend. If anyone's got a reason to complain about being given a bummed in life, Solzhenitsyn is that man. And after surviving 7 years of prison, just when he's released, not to go home, by the way, but to internal exile in Kazakhstan, a long way from Moscow. Just when he's released from prison to be in exile, he discovers he has what's believed to be terminal cancer, that he's dying. And what does he do? Does he curse heaven? Does he curse God and say, this is the final straw? I've climbed every mountain and this is too much. To hell with you. No. Shortly before that, he has a conversation with someone, prisoner, just before he's released. And this prisoner is a convert, a Jewish convert to Christianity. And this person says to him that if you look carefully, if you go over your life with a fine-tooth comb, every suffering you receive, you deserve. Solzhenitsyn is laying in bed suffering from cancer. And he hears this. And they're possibly the last words that person ever says. Because that person, Boris Kornfeld is his name, is murdered in his bed that night, hit over the head repeatedly with a mallet. And Solzhenitsyn says, well, that's the legacy. Someone says that to you and then they're murdered that night. That's going to change you. But then he said, well, hang on for a second. What does that mean? Does that mean, what about the people that don't suffer? What about the guards in the prisons? What about those who have sold their soul to communism for comfort so they won't suffer? To take this philosophy to its logical conclusion means that we are worse sinners than they are, because we're suffering more than they are. So what about Stalin, living in comfort, who has ordered the murder of tens of millions of people? How do we make that fit in with that philosophy? Solzhenitsyn says those people suffer because they've turned into subhuman swine. They've ceased to be human. He said, but what he's learned is that Kornfeld's words make sense on a one-on-one basis for each of us as individuals. As we grow in knowledge of who we are, and we look at who we are with honesty, and our lives with honesty, irrespective of what other people are doing, that's not our business. Then Solzhenitsyn said, yes, it's true. For every suffering I've endured, I've deserved. And so, believing he's going to die, he makes the final step, a movement he's been moving towards for some time, and he converts to Russian Orthodoxy. He becomes a Christian. There's a wonderful poem I quote in here, which I'm not going to quote now. Even in translation, when the rhyme's lost, it's still beautiful, about his conversion. And then, some might say miraculously, he recovers from the cancer. He doesn't die. From that moment on, he begins to document the horrors of the Soviet regime. He begins to write. From that moment on, Solzhenitsyn is a time bomb under the Soviet regime. Every book he writes is going to explode. It's going to undermine the communist regime. So just give a few of the titles. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, a very short novel. And if you're going to read nothing else by Solzhenitsyn other than my book, which you're all going to rush over there and purchase immediately, apart from that, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn is only about 120, 150 pages long. It's a novella. And it's just one day in the prison camps as seen by one prisoner. It's a classic, and it doesn't take long to read, unlike most of the rest of his works. But his two other great novels are In the First Circle, about his experiences in that special prison camp for scientists, and Cancer Ward. And again, this is really a profound meditation upon the nature of life, death, suffering. And there's a wonderful play called Candle in the Wind. It's got other titles depending upon which translation, but Candle in the Wind. And the key thing about that play is there's a woman in it, and this plays actually very closely into what the Immaculata Academy is doing with incorporating and including children with Down syndrome within the school and the life of the school. Because this woman in the play is highly strung, super sensitive. You might say that psychologically she's a mess. She suffers terribly because of her hypersensitivity. So she becomes a guinea pig of neuroscientists who operate on her brain so she won't have to suffer. And at the end of the novel, she's comfortably numb. All right, this will put you to the test. How many people here have listened to The Wall or seen The Wall by Pink Floyd? Well, not much more than I've actually read Solzhenitsyn. That's not too bad. But there's a song in The Wall by Pink Floyd called Comfortably Numb. I have become comfortably numb, okay? And what Solzhenitsyn is doing in that play, of course, is they've actually destroyed that person by removing the suffering from her life. She ceased to actually exist as a fully functional human being because she's become comfortably numb. She's anesthetized from reality. And probably the most important thing he wrote is the Gulag Archipelago in 3 volumes, which catalogues the Soviet prison system, the communist prison system, from the revolution right through to the 1970s, 60s when he's writing this. Written in secret, of course, smuggled out of the country, as with the rest of his manuscripts. Not published. Only One Day in the Life of Denisovich was published in the Soviet Union, and that was for one moment when after the death of Stalin, that they allowed the criticism of Stalin, and then it came down again. After that, everything else had to be written in secret, smuggled out the country. By the way, as regards modern Russia, because there were certain people, and I'm not going to get involved in too much politics here, you'll be very pleased to know, and so will I be pleased to know. But there are some people here that want to just resurrect the Cold War and make the new Russia as bad as the old Soviet Union. Let me just say one thing on that, is that every single high schooler in Russia has to read, compulsory, on the curriculum, the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which catalogues the Soviet prison system. It's an abridged version, because obviously it's 3 volumes, so it's still one fairly thick volume they have to read, and the abridged version was overseen by Solzhenitsyn's widow. So it's authentic, authorized, if you like, by Solzhenitsyn himself. Every single Russian high school student has to read about the hideous nature of the Soviet Union. In our country now, by the way, communism is de rigueur amongst the millennials and the post-millennials. Lenin's a hero because of their ignorance of history. How much better off we would be if every American high schooler had to read the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. All right, to draw things to a close here, because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A, and time for someone to get me another glass of wine. In 1970, Solzhenitsyn, who's still living in Russia, in Soviet Union, I should say, was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, which of course outraged the Soviet Union. He couldn't go and collect the prize because he would never be let back in again. And the following year, there was a failed assassination attempt on his life. This wasn't in the first edition of my Solzhenitsyn biography. It's in this one because the KGB files were not opened when I wrote the first edition in the late 1990s. When the revised edition 10 years later was done, they were opened. And 2 KGB operatives actually confessed to using a toxin, very similar to the use. Some of you might remember, I can't remember his name now, a diplomat in London who was stabbed with an umbrella. And that killed him. It was the same toxin that was used on Solzhenitsyn. They just put it on his skin. But first, it wasn't as developed as well. And putting it on the skin didn't quite kill him. It almost killed him. He was seriously ill for 2 or 3 weeks, and no one knew what the cause was. But he survived. In 1974, he's charged with treason and expelled from the Soviet Union. He lived for 1 year in Zurich, in Switzerland, and then he moves to the United States, and lives in the United States from 1975 until 1994, for almost 20 years in Vermont, in Cavendish, Vermont, before, following the fall of the Soviet Union and the coming down of the wall, he returned to Russia in 1994. I don't have time to say anything about the Harvard address, so you can always ask a question about that or some of his political ideas. But what I would like to do, just to conclude, say something which I think is encouraging. When Solzhenitsyn returned to Russia, no one was interested in listening to him. He was finished old past. We've got rid of communism now. We don't need people reminding us of it. He was irrelevant. And that obviously is very sad. What happened basically, you have a boy, you have the pressure cooker on, no freedom, and then the pressure cooker's removed, everybody has a party. Everyone embraced the worst hedonism of the West. Solzhenitsyn said, I'm not opposed to the West. I consider Russia to be part of the West. He said, if the wall had come down and the cream of Western culture had come into Russia, I would have rejoiced. He said, but the wall came up and all the dregs of Western culture, pornography, bad television, bad movies, crept in. But here's the happy ending. Following the party, there's the hangover. And all of a sudden, by the early 2000s, this old man Solzhenitsyn is being seen as the old man who encapsulates what the new Russia needs to be. The wisdom. So whenever Putin wanted to pass some new laws on education or anything else, he would be seen to be visiting Solzhenitsyn and seeking his advice. Russian television brought out a very long, I can't remember how many episodes, say 12-episode version of Solzhenitsyn's novel, In the First Circle. The other Russian TV channel to compete with it on the first night of this series showed The Terminator by Arnie Schwarzenegger, which is certainly more entertaining on a lowbrow level than something which is talking about suffering. But I can't remember what the figures are now. But the audience for the Solzhenitsyn drama was twice that. For the Schwarzenegger, it was huge success. And as I said, now the Gulag Archipelago is compulsory reading. So just to finish, I want to say two things. Heroism, being a hero and being a giant. 20th century was full of giants, but most of them weren't heroes. Lenin was a giant. Stalin was a giant. Hitler was a giant. Mao Zedong was a giant. The 20th century was also full of heroes, most of whom were not giants. The tens of millions of people who heroically resisted communism in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China, and Vietnam, Cambodia, who were put to death. We don't even know who they are. Their names are lost to history. Not giants, but heroes. And there are a few people who are both heroes and giants. And in the 20th century, I think, for instance, at the beginning of the century, St. Pius X and his warnings about modernism and where it would lead. And at the end of the century, St. John Paul II, with his teaching and his experience of where modernism did lead, communism and fascism and Nazism and abortion, the culture of death, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Because if you had to find name three people that were absolutely instrumental and crucial to the bringing down of the whole Soviet Empire because of their influence, it would be Ronald Reagan, whatever we think of him, St. John Paul II, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I'm going to finish finally by asking one more question. How many people here have read 1984 by George Orwell? Okay, many of you. This is for me, the most encouraging thing about the life and legacy and example of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. At the very moment that George Orwell is writing his novel 1984, Alexander Solzhenitsyn is languishing in a Soviet prison cell. The hero in George Orwell's novel, Winston Smith, tries to resist the tyranny of Big Brother and is ultimately crushed. And not just crushed physically, I mean, Orwell really did his job well. Crushed spiritually. He denied everything. He denied his love for Julia. He denied his hatred for Big Brother. He completely and utterly conformed. Orwell's message is ultimately Big Brother is indestructible, get used to it, you might hate it, there's nothing you can do about it. Meanwhile, one man, like an ant, amongst millions in the Soviet prison system, says, I am going to expose this tyranny, single-handedly if necessary. And he composed and recited in his head hundreds and hundreds of lines of poetry. He had no pen and paper to write with. That's how he began to write. And at the end, he lives to see the destruction of Big Brother. He gets to go back home to the country that Big Brother expelled him from. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is a St. George who slayed the red dragon, and a David who slayed a Goliath. That's the most encouraging lesson we get from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Thank you.